Okay, today it's finally the day to end the debate. Use client or use server? What should you use? Why should you do so? What are, common mistakes in doing so? And we're going to go through everything I really try it very shortly. So let's get into it and let's start a little bit basically with, the basics. What is client and what is the server? So if we take a look at that here now, let's say we have two things here, which is the client and the server. So we call it like client and server. So these are the relevant two, stations. So you are typically the client, the browser, you as the end user are the client, and the server is typically something like a data center anywhere. I will write that on the top here, data center, maybe, I don't know, maybe let's say Vercel, where you deploy your app. So any computer in the world, like in the US, for example. And the client, it's typically you, or your browser, better said. So we have those two stations, and they need to communicate with each other. So I will get a little bit space here. So we have those arrows, and we say, okay, I want a page. So you make a page request. Let's call it page request. Like that, and then the server is responding with an answer. So we say this is answer, for example. So that's the typical flow of things. You request a page and you get the answer from the server. So what now? In typical frameworks like React, and I think a lot of people that are going with Next come from React. So in React, everything was client-side. So what would happen is you do a page request and you get a blank HTML back, like just an empty page, and the client is building the page. So everything gets shipped to the client, everything that is needed, like the JavaScript code, for example, that need to run, and the client is building the web page. This has some problems. I will get to that. With server-side, it's not like that. You do the page request, that's the same, but the server is building everything. So building everything, don't worry about some typos, and then shipped to client, but not just a blank page, full finished page. So the server is generating your whole page, and then the whole page is getting shipped to the client, and this has some benefits. So we get into that, of course. So that's like the simple structure. What is the client? What is the server? Now, what is use client and use server? That's just like a declarative on the top of your, let's say I just have a simple Next.js app here, nothing special. Let's just go into a page TSX here, for example. And here on the top, you can write something like use server. You can write something like use client, or you do nothing, and that means use server too, or at least it's server side. I will get to that. So use client and use server are just some declaratives that you can put on the top of your file, so the compiler knows what this file is. Should it run on the client, like the React type of way, or should it run on the server, like the Next.js type of way, or the, I would say, new, better way. And why this is the better way, we will get to that also. So that are the two things what use client and use server is. So now we already know the difference of use client and use server and how to activate it for a page. But now let's get into when to use what. So what are the differences? So now this type of component here, I will do it a little bit bigger now. This is a server component. Why is it a server component? Because that's the basic, the standard in Next.js is server component. So if you write nothing on top, it's a server component. How can we test that? Let's just run the app, get on localhost 3000 here, and this is rendered on the server, and we do a console log server component rendered, and you can see that console log here now. Don't worry about these other logs, we get to them later. Or let me just quickly comment them here out so we don't get too much of a overload here at the console. And now OneDrive is doing an update, very cool. So now we get back into a browser, we refresh, we get back to Visual Studio Code, and we see server component rendered. So we have two types of consoles. The console in your terminal, right into your application, where you just run npm run dev, and then you get the console. This is like the server, and then you have the console in your browser. And we got this at the Exali draw in the painting at the beginning of the video, where I said that the browser is the client. So then you have this console. I will get a little bit into zoom here because I think you won't see anything. So we have the console here too. Now we just refresh that and we refresh the page, and you see, okay, nothing is logged because that is the client here. So you have the server, which is your terminal, and you have the client, which is this. So now when we know that, we need to talk about when should we use a client component, or when do we need a client component? Because I would suggest you don't go for client components. That's a React type of way. Go for server components because of some reason I will tell you about in a few minutes. So client component. The first thing is interactivity. Let's say you want not AP, you want a button here. So let's do a button, and let's say click me. Now nothing is happening. It's all working. We see server component rendered at the button. But let's use an event listener, like on click. So let's say on click, something should happen, like a console.log clicked, for example. And now if I save, oh, some things are happening here. Event handlers cannot be passed to client component props. So all types of event listeners are not allowed in server components. If I type use client here now, everything will work except for the fact that this is an async component. So we need to get rid of that. And now everything is working again. So we can go into the browser, we can click the button, and you see here in the console of the client now, clicked. And you also see server component rendered in the client now. So this is not a server component anymore. This is now a client component. So interactivity, all types of event listeners are interactivity. Like, let's say you have dialogues you want to open, you have sliders or drop downs. This is all listening on some events of your browser. Maybe your mouse events, if you click something, if you hold something. This is all event listeners and related to interactivity, which is not allowed in server components. So everything that is user specific is not allowed in server components. You really need to be aware of that. So, and the second thing is React hooks. We all know the React hook use state, for example. Let's just do a const, I don't know, let's say counter, and set counter is equal to use state 0, for example. We import it from React. Now everything is working. That is not a problem. But as soon as I delete the use client at the top, and let's get rid of the button now and the on click listener here. So server component. Okay, now we get a different error. We get, okay, the use state, something is wrong here. You're importing a component that needs use state. It only works in a client component. So every type of React hook, you know, like, I don't know, use state, use effect, they are not working because they are client side, because React is a client side framework. So if you want to save the state of a user or do side effects, you need to go for a use client directive at the top to declare that. The third thing is if you rely on, let's say, client-side libraries. There are a lot of libraries out there, especially made for React. React was client-side. The libraries were often client-side, so they just work on the client-side. And most of the time, you don't get very good error messages while using the JS libraries, so you really need to be aware. And the fourth thing is any type of user-specific data. Let's say you want to use, I don't know, you have hooks like use path name from Next Navigation. They are all client-side because they are user-specific and looking at the URL at the top. Let's say validation with Zot. So you have a form and you want to validate it on the client. You want to validate it on the client. That's a typical way to validate. It's only working on client-side. You need to be aware of that. Forms are often client-side, actually. There are some possibilities to do it on the server, but yeah, maybe I will make a video about that. So now we know when should we use a client component. But now I want to head over when should we use a server component. And the simple answer to that is every time, actually. Just try to go for server component every time. And when you need something like interactivity or the hooks or something I mentioned, then go for client component, because server components has some benefits. And the benefit is, for example, the SEO. But yeah, what is SEO? Search engine optimization, and you want that because that's basically the factor of how good your web page is ranked on search engines like Google, for example. So they have web crawlers and they want to see what's on your web page. If you have a client-side application, they just see the blank page. So they don't know anything about your web application. So with server-side, you or the web crawlers get already the whole rendered page and they know exactly what's on the web page. And if they like it, they will rank you higher. So your website gets more viewers. So your shop, for example, gets more sales. And that's what you want. The second thing is if you do data fetching, very simple. You can do it with actions now in Next.js, but I don't want to get a deep dive into that here now. But that's a good reason for server components, because then you get something like a additional security layer, because the code that is on the server gets never shipped to the client, which leads me to the next positive reason of using use server or using server components in general. So you have reduced package sizes. That means less gets shipped to the client. That means the client has to load less data, so the web application gets faster, because if less data is need to load it, for example, for the initial site load, then everything gets quicker. So you have just 40 kilobytes instead of 80, for example. If you have any questions about this video, go into the comments and I will answer, or I will try to answer everything, and hopefully we can start a discussion there. So that was the different side of Next.js use client and use server. So let's get now into some common mistakes of both. Oh, I forgot one thing. You can type use server on the top too, like that. I mentioned that very shortly. When should you use that? I would suggest you to just do that for data mutations. So let's say you have a file in your application called actions.ts where you have your server actions. And now I would suggest you to do use server here on the top and to write your server actions inside of that file. I would not suggest you to do that for simple operations like just getting data. There you should just get or leave it like, don't use server because you don't need that endpoint. But if you want to get deeper into this topic, we can talk about that in a separate video. Just let me know. I just don't want this video to blow up too much, so I will not get into that very much. So what are now the common mistakes with use client and use server? Very quickly. The most common mistakes is using server components in client components, because that's not possible. I have a simple example for that. Let's comment that two things here in. So we just have this simple example here. We have a client component. So on top, use client, as you know. And now, oh, this is a little typo, but I think it will still work. I just have a little typo here. Doesn't care. So we just console log in here, client component rendered. And yeah, client component rendered. And now we use a server component inside of that. So the server component is the one we already know, which is just console logging out server component rendered. If we go for that approach now, then let's just use the client component 2 here now and go into our browser, refresh the page, and what we see here now is client component rendered and server component rendered. So our server component gets rendered on the client. Why is that like that? And inside of here, we get also client component and server component rendered, but is just because in Next.js, also the client code gets executed on the server once from the compiler. So don't get confused if you see it on both sides. That doesn't mean it ran on the server, like it gets rendered on the server. It just ran on the server. So client component 2 here now. Our client component imports the server component. And every time you import a server component into a client component, it gets completely translated to a client component. You really need to be aware of that. That's one of the most common issues for big problems, which are very hard to solve. So the only way you can go to import a client component or to use a server component inside of a client component is to use the children as props. So we have a client component here, again, use client, and I again say client component rendered, and now we're getting children as props. And what we can do here now is go for that approach where we give the server component inside of the client component, but not as an import, instead as children. So if we do this now and we head back in this thing here and do a refresh, then we see just the client component is rendered on the client like it's supposed to do. And on the server component, we see server component rendered. And we see it 2 times. So client component and server component for the initial run on the server 1 time, but no rendering. And the server component for it really has run on the server. So I know this is a little bit complex, but just keep in your mind, the only way to use a server component inside of a client component is with the children pattern. That's the only way, okay? So the second mistake, which I have seen a lot of times, is that people are using useClient everywhere because it makes things initially easier. So if you have any errors with useClient because you want interactivity or something like that, always just, let's say you have a button. You have a simple button in your application. Let's go into a server component and we want to have, let's say we have a fragment here, and now we want a button here inside, and we have our P server component. And maybe we have so much more in this component, which is a server component. And now we have this on click here and are wondering, why is this not working? Yeah, because it's a server component. So we typically, what a lot of people would do is to just say use client here at the top, but you don't have to do, or don't have to go that way. You should just take this button, make a new component, make this component use client and everything that's client specific into this component. And then you can just use this client component in the server component, because using a client component as a server component is no problem. You can always do it. So be aware of that. That's very, very handy. And yeah, that's basically already everything I had to say about use server and use client. I hope this is not longer than 20 minutes. Okay, but yeah, what did we learn? We learn common mistakes. When should you use client component? When should you use server component? What is the client? What is the server? What are the benefits of using use server or using use client? If I forgot anything, do a shout out in the comments. We can open a discussion there. I'm very happy if we get to know different opinions there. And yeah, I would love to hear something about that from your side. Thank you for watching that video, and we see each other in the next video. Thank you. Bye bye.